Good morning. We are on 21a, coming to the end of the page. As I was uploading the video yesterday, it seemed like this page is probably the longest page it took us. Something like 8, 9 classes to get through this page. Lots to discuss, lots to brag about. So we're coming to the final lines of this page. And we should read the final lines in this discussion. And then the next page tomorrow, we'll get into more detail about women studying Torah. We discussed it a little bit when we learned the Mishnah, you'll recall. So we'll have a more broad discussion, I guess, on Monday. So for today, we're still on the topic of the virtue, the merit, and the blessings, the reward provided for Torah and mitzvahs, respectively. This is here in context of the Sotah woman who has a merit that would defer her demise if she is indeed guilty. And the conclusion we came to yesterday, or 2 days ago, a few days ago, whatever it was, is that the merit she has is the merit of Torah, because the merit of Torah is the only kind of merit that has this kind of long-lasting effect. The merit of mitzvah does not have that long-lasting effect. As for the fact that she's not obligated to study Torah, but her partnership with her husband gives her that merit. And we discussed what that means at some length. Now, in the course of our discussion about the virtues of Torah and mitzvahs, respectively, the Gemoro told us the following statement, which is, so let's see that statement. We're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines from the bottom of the page. The first word is the Hilchasa, and the next word is Dalad Aleph, which stands for Davar Acher. So in the course of our discussion, the Gemara mentioned the following statement, which is Davar Acher, another reading of the verse which says, but this was Rabbi Menachem Bar Yossi expounded the verse which says, Kimner mitzvah Torah. Mitzvah is a candle, and Torah is light. Torah is daylight. And he explained that just like a candle is only temporary and minimal light and therefore protection, the daylight has much stronger protection. The everlasting protection never goes out. Can't even compare it. And that's that's how we think of Torah and mitzvahs, that the reward, the merit, the effect of Torah on the person is like the effect of the sun, which never goes away, as opposed to the effect of mitzvah, which is only like a candle. Now, Rabbi Menachem Bar Yossi went on to say, here's another way of understanding why mitzvah is like a candle and Torah is like light. He said, why? Because a aveda machaba mitzvah, a sin can put out a mitzvah, but the ein aveda machaba Torah, but a sin cannot put out Torah. Just like no matter how bad the world is, the sun is still shining. When it comes to so too with Torah, even if there's sin, Torah light still shines. The effect the Torah has on the person still remains, even if God forbid he sinned. But when it comes to mitzvah, a sin can undo the Torah, can undo the mitzvah. Like a candle can be extinguished can be extinguished. Right? So that was another way of understanding how mitzvah is like a candle and Torah is like the sunlight. And we explained what this means at length in the previous class. This is where we discussed how to understand Rashi's interpretation. We talked about the reward being canceled out by the sin. And we explained that perhaps what this means, right? We talked about the Mishnah, which says one mitzvah leads to another. So if a person sins, he breaks that chain. Yeah. Right? Because we also talked about this idea that, a connection to God is eternal. So a person does a mitzvah, the mitzvah is eternal. But that eternality only exists in the spiritual sense. On the person who's living here in this physical world, a person doing a mitzvah, so he feels connected. And then when he does a sin, God forbid, his feeling of connection is outdone. So even if the mitzvah exists spiritually forever, the effect on the person is not forever, like a candle which goes out. Right? This is what we discussed. So now the Gemara is going to talk a little further to this point, that sin can put out the effect of the mitzvah, whereas sin does not put out the effect of Torah. Because even if a person slips and misbehaves, if he's inculcated and incorporated Torah way of thinking, that doesn't go away just because he misbehaved. His way of thinking, his way of understanding the world, the Torah effect on his mind still remains, even if, God forbid, he slipped up. Whereas the effect of the mitzvah can be the effect the mitzvah has on the person can be counteracted by the behaviors of sin. This is what we discussed. So let's see a little bit more to that point. Yeah.
So this would take sometimes you take 10 seconds.
That's right.
Or it could take a minute to do.
That's right.
Or it could take an hour. Whereas Torah study, you don't study it for a minute.
Yeah.
You're studying that for hours.
That's right. First of all, Torah study takes more time, and especially if we're talking about Torah study, especially if we're talking about Torah study as we discussed, where the person doesn't just learn and read it nonchalantly, but thinks about it, incorporates it into his way of thinking. Right? The act of a mitzvah is hard to incorporate into the person, right? We explained this, that the mitzvah you engage in, but Torah goes into you. It's the reverse, right?
I'm not sure how it's extinguished.
The effect on the person. So we do mitzvahs every day, and unfortunately we slip. We also slip every day, right?
Yeah. So how does that affect?
So
does
let's
it affect the mitzvah that we had already done, or does it?
right.
affect
So the mitzvah we done,
forward?
the spiritual truth of that mitzvah exists forever.
Yeah.
We're talking about the effect on the person. When a person's done a mitzvah, he feels a certain elation, he feels a certain connection to God. Right? When a person does a sin 20 minutes later, that feeling of connection is gone. He has to recreate it with a new mitzvah.
So the connection created by the mitzvah
Exists, the spiritual exists forever. But the effect on the person,
that's what gets affected.
that's right. And the person does a sin, he has to do a new mitzvah to recreate what he felt. But when it comes to Torah, even if a person slipped up, the way he thinks still remains the same.
Yeah.
Because the Torah shaped the way you think. This is at least the way we were understanding it.
It's almost
This is our suggested interpretation based on our discussions on time.
Easier something comes, easier it goes.
That's right.
Taken,
That's correct.
lasting.
This is what Chabad refers to as pnimius. So Chabad puts a big emphasis on pnimius, which means internalization, as opposed to makif, which is like external and envelops you. Like for example, even let's say let's say a Fabrengen. Person sits by Fabrengen. It's a very uplifting experience, and he's taken by it. There's great negunim and there's great discussion, so he's elevated to another place, right? If that's where it remains, then the next day he has got what they call what do they call it? Like a person has a low after a high. What's it called? The person, sorry, a downer, because he was in this great lofty experience. The experience is over when he feels left hanging, like he's left with nothing. He feels a little down, right? Because he didn't internalize it. He was enveloped by it. He was taken by it, but he didn't internalize it. Exactly. But if the person by the Fabrengen decides to zero in on one point, it really drills it into his mind, drills it into his heart, takes upon himself a resolution that he's going to behave or think or do or in accord with something he discussed at the Fabrengen. So even as the high is gone, that what he internalized remains with it. Right? That's the difference between mitzvah and Torah. Mitzvah, you're engaged in it, and if you're fully engaged in it, it's a high. But then, God forbid, there's a sin comes later, and the high is gone, and there's the opposite. But with Torah, if a person's studying and really trying to process it and absorbing it and internalizing it, it stays with them, even if he slipped up, God forbid. This is the way we understood this teaching in our previous classes.
There's another thing also. If you do a mitzvah, you don't brag about it.
Or at least you shouldn't brag about it.
When you're learning Torah, you want to share it with everybody.
So that's another challenge. It's another challenge we discussed earlier, the humility in studying Torah. We discussed this with respect to prayer and the necessity to incorporate humility and
you learn from that.
Okay, so let's go further. Let's see what the Gemara has to say. So Rav Yosef says, Darshir Rabbi Menachem bar Yossi l'haikra. Rabbi Menachem bar Yossi, who explained this verse earlier, that the Torah is like light and the candle, and the mitzvah is like a candle, and just like a candle, you can put it out. So can the effect of mitzvah be God forbid, put out. Whereas Torah is like the light of the sun, which cannot be put out. So said Rav Yosef that Rav Menachem bar Yossi explained this, ki Sinai, like Sinai. He explained it amazing like Sinai. And Vilmolid Dershua Doeg Bachiteifel. If Doeg and Achiteifel would have understood this, Hachi in this manner, they would have understood that verse, the way Rav Menachem bar Yossi explained it. Roy Lodfu Bosa David. They would have not chased after David. They wouldn't have become David's antagonists. Right? We mentioned Doeg and Achitophel before. We mentioned him previously in the Gemara as two scholars who started out on David's side, but then later became King David's antagonists, each respectively in their own story. So for Torah scholars, how is it? So we discussed it. We discussed the different levels of Torah study. Torah study as an intellectual pursuit versus Torah study because this is God's Torah. Right? We discussed what that means. But here the Gemara tells us like this. Rav Yosef says that if Doeg and Achitophel would have known what Menachem bar Yossi said, that a sin cannot put out a mitzvah, but sin cannot put out Torah, had they known that, they wouldn't have chased King David. Now, why did they chase King David in the first place? This because the verse reads, Leimar Elakim Azavu. King David says in Tehillim, it's in Tehillim chapter 71, verse 11, that because people said, God abandoned me, therefore they chased after me. The verse is implying, King David's implying, that my antagonists, Doeg and Achitophel, assumed God abandoned me. Why did they assume God abandoned me? Because my daughters, what did Doeg and Achitophel, what verse did they derive to conclude mistakenly, thinking that God abandoned King David? The verse reads, etc. The verse reads as follows. I'm going to read the whole verse for you. It's in Dvarim. Dvarim is Deuteronomy, right? 23:15. The verse reads like this: because God your Lord goes with you in your camp to save you and to give your enemies before you, like to protect, give your enemies before you. Your camp shall be holy. This is a commandment to keep the camp clean and holy and so on. And there should be no sexual promiscuity. Because if you don't, meaning if there is promiscuity, then God turns away from you. So Doeg and Achitophel reasoned that's the case, but the verse says that if there's, God forbid, promiscuity, God abandons. So King David's been abandoned because he misbehaved with Bat Sheva. The famous story, right? We learned this in the Gemoro earlier, where King David asked God to test him. God says, no, don't do that. And David says, yes, I can handle it. And the next morning he woke up, he saw Bat Sheva, and he succumbed. So Doeg and Achitophel said, the verse says that when a person pays promiscuity, God abandons. So God abandoned King David. And this is the meaning of the verse, where King David says in Tehillim, these my enemies, they said that God abandoned me. This is referring to Doeg and Achitophel, who assumed that because King David misbehaved, God abandoned. So says Rav Yosef, had they learned what Menachem bar Yossi said, they wouldn't have made that mistake. Because they didn't know that which Menachem bar Yossi taught, that a sin can put out or take away the effect of a mitzvah. And that's what the verse means when the verse said that a person who has promiscuity, God abandons them. That's if their merit is specifically only mitzvah. And then they have the sin of promiscuity, they've been abandoned. But sin doesn't put out the effect of Torah. And therefore, King David, because he has Torah scholarship, even though he was misbehaved, God still didn't abandon him. This is what Rabbi Yosef says, which is quite a heavy statement. Right? Yeah.
It seems like having knowledge of that the mitzvah is only temporary and the study of Torah is longer lasting. To me, it doesn't seem that it was necessary to have knowledge of that idea, rather just to have it. In other words, if those scholars had it, then they wouldn't have succumbed to that.
Right.
Why
So
did they have to have the knowledge of it in order?
I was going to make that point. So we have to combine this
Am I
statement.
making
Yeah.
that
In
clear?
other words, if they themselves had Torah scholarship, then they should know that it has a longer effect.
Right, you don't need to have.
You have to have the
learned
verse
it,
specific.
It's just, it would have been part of them, if it was really internalized as the verses.
That's right. Right. So which is why we have to go back to what we talked about in the previous Gemara. We talked in the previous Gemara, right, where Rava said, how is it possible that Torah has a long-lasting effect? Torah gonna study Torah, and yet they made a mistake. Right? So Rava at the simple level disagreed with Rav Yosef and said, no, it doesn't have a long-lasting effect. Right? And we explained that we suggested that perhaps the difference between Rav Yosef's view, perhaps there's different types of Torah study. If Torah study is based with the understanding and humility that this is God's Torah, then it has that long-lasting effect. But if the person studying Torah, because it's a beautiful intellectual pursuit, and as he studies Torah, gets more and more arrogant, then he can easily lose sight of what it is. So in other words, Doeg and Echatefil's personal experience with Torah study did not have that long-lasting effect. Because it had, that's right, because they saw themselves becoming more arrogant as they studied. So they didn't see Torah study in their personal effect as long-lasting. They saw Torah study as the effect that Torah study had on them. Intellectual pursuit. They're getting more and more arrogant, and now they do their own thing, and they abandon King David. And they say, "Look, Torah doesn't have no effect on me. Doesn't have no effect on him. And look at him; he sinned too."
They did need that teaching.
So they had this teaching to understand that when you study Torah properly, it has a long-lasting effect, and they wouldn't have abandoned King David. This is perhaps how to understand this Gemara by combining it with the way we understood the previous Gemara, right? But what it teaches you is something else. First of all, we also have to remember that the Gemara explains elsewhere in a number of places how even though King David's relationship with Bat Sheva was on the border of sin, it wasn't actually technically sin because her husband died before they were together.
Plus he was a king.
He was a king, so he had all kinds of legal loopholes that allowed him to be with her. But nonetheless, it was certainly a mistake, and to a large, it was a big mistake, and to a large degree, we discussed this before. To a large degree, most of Tehillim is King David begging God, please forgive me for that one sin. Right?
Is that why he wasn't allowed to build the base of Mikdash? One of the reasons that he.
The main reason it's
was
usually
left
quote
to Solomon. He could only start
a process. I don't remember if that's
foundation.
I don't remember if that's on the list of reasons. The main reason it's usually quoted for why King David couldn't build a temple is because he had too much wars,
And too many wars.
too much blood on his hands. Even though he was defending the Jewish people, but nonetheless, he had also internal rebellions. King Solomon, who was all peacetime, he was able to build a temple because the temple's all about bringing peace to the world.
Yeah.
So that's usually what's quoted. But what's interesting here is nothing that's interesting to point out is Gemara is telling us something very deep, which is a person's animal soul never goes away. Even if a person studies Torah on the level of King David. So therefore his promiscuity, his desire for promiscuity is gone. It's not the case. And knowing that is very important. Because the moment the person thinks that, oh, I'm good enough, I'm above that kind of thing, that's when he's going to slip. Which is the Gemara tells us about King David. That whole story, if you remember, we learned this once, where King David asked God, why is it that the Jewish people say Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob? How come they don't say Elokei David, the God of David? So God said, because I tested them and they passed. So David says, so test me. God says, I don't know if you want that. He says, yeah, I can handle it. God said, I'm going to tell you what I'm testing you about, and it's still going to be challenging for you.
That's arrogance already.
That's right. And remember that, right? And God told King David, your test is, that's exactly. God told King David, your test is going to be on the issue of promiscuity. David said, no worries, I'm going to be ready. He woke up in the morning, called his wife, one of his wives, get his desire out of the way, and he'll be fine for the day. And then a little while later, he sees Bat Sheva bathing, right? And he succumbs, right? So what's the kernel of the mistake there, so to speak? It's his assumption, I'm okay. I'll be okay. I can handle it. And as soon as you say I can handle it, there's the mistake. Right? So even someone with Torah scholarship of King David has to know that he's capable. And then there's a second thing, which is if a person studies Torah and really shapes his mind to think in a proper way, even if he misbehaves, and misbehaves on a very serious manner, he should not all of a sudden write himself off. Everything I did till now is all gone. because I misbehaved. Nope. All the years you spent inculcating a proper way of thinking doesn't go away just because you gave into your animal soul one day. Because you have an animal soul and you have a godly soul. And the muscles the muscle, so to speak, the strength that you've given your godly soul over all this time doesn't disappear just because your animal soul gave into your animal soul one day. Certainly, you have to spend your time doing teshuvah like King David did. Most of Tehillim, as I mentioned, a massive chunk of Tehillim is all King David begging God for forgiveness. Right. So certainly, but still, the Gemara is telling us God didn't abandon him just because he misbehaved. But that's only if a person studies Torah, if a person, incorporates divine way of thinking into his mind, giving his godly soul that kind of strength. And even if he slips with the animal soul, doesn't mean his godly soul not lost all his strength. Yeah, that's why Yosef is called Yosef HaTzadik. Why is he called Yosef HaTzadik? Because he was on a business trip in China and he could have got away with something with no one who would know, and he still didn't get away with it. Still didn't do it. I'm using a modern example. He wasn't in China, but the point is there.
He still went to prison.
And he still went to prison for it. That's right. Exactly.
So is the person his own worst enemy in this case? In other words,
we're always our own worst enemy.
No, sure. If a person is engaged purely in mitzvot and he slips, he'll say to himself, "That's it. I'm done. I messed up. I can't get back on the wagon."
Yeah. There's always teshuvah, right?
But a person who studies Torah is more likely to say, "Okay, I messed up, but I'm going to keep forging ahead."
That's right.
Because he has that.
He still has the knowledge. That's right.
Of Torah to get him to keep going.
That's correct. Okay. Because he's internalized Torah at such a level, it'll support his teshuvah later.
Right.
It'll support his teshuvah. First, two things. Number one, he won't get bogged down by the slip up. Number two, he'll actually understand what it means that he slipped up. And the more deeply he understands what it means he slipped up, the more deep his teshuvah is. Meaning
transform.
That's right. That's right. Because if you understand, the more deeply he understands that what sin does to him and what the sin does to his relationship to God, the more deeply his teshuvah can be. So the Torah that he studied before his sin will actually support his teshuvah. Elevate it, support it. That's right. That's right. Yeah. So it's a very powerful teaching.
Like Jews who are becoming more observant. Sometimes, when you're dealing with people who are on that track, and they fall back and they say, I've committed so many sins. How could I possibly ever become observant with what I did in my previous life?
Yeah.
People will say, I can't.
Yeah. The Gemoro says elsewhere that the reason why God allowed, so to speak, or God set up David to have that kind of story, the reason why it's recorded for generations is to teach the Bat Sheva. Even someone who did something like that can still come back. Right? Especially as we're learning here, if he shapes his mind. No, let me rephrase that. Let me put it this way. Perhaps we can expand this a bit more. It's not only for someone who has Torah study from before his sin that helps him after his sin. But after the sin, Torah studies would be the proper way to do teshuvah. Right? Torah is the counteraction to this kind of behavior, not just doing mitzvahs, which is good. But a person really wants to transform the past. The study of Torah will do that for him, reshaping the way he thinks, reshaping the way he feels, reshaping the way he relates to himself, to God, to mitzvahs, to the world. That perhaps is also another way of understanding this. Not just the Torah from before, but the Torah that comes after also itself has that value. Maybe.
Because we often get arguments from people that there's no point in me.
It's too late already.
Carrying on, trying to carry on with that. Forget it.
It's a big mistake, yeah.
Usually somebody who keeps doing mitzvahs after mitzvahs and from the shul and from every day, he's got a bit of Torah study too.
Certainly.
Back him up.
Right, yeah, right. It's not as if these two are mutually exclusive. It's either mitzvahs or Torah. Usually people have a mix of both. Maybe they're more dominant in one than the other. Most probably have a mix of both. And the question is which side of the coin are you, the advantage of which side of which coin are you playing to, right? Sure. But not that they exist mutually exclusive. A person only has this or only has that. Sure. Anyway. Okay, final thought the Gemara has on this discussion. The Gemara quoted a verse earlier to make this point that the study of Torah never gets put out like the sunlight. It quoted a verse which reads, Many waters cannot put out the love. This is a verse in the Song of Songs. And the love the Gemara told us is referring to Torah. So the many waters cannot put out the effect of Torah. That's what the verse means. Now that same verse goes on to say like this. Read the whole verse. Many waters cannot put out the love, referring to Torah, and rivers cannot overflow it. If a person were to give all of the treasures of his house, ba'ava, for this love, it would surely be a waste, or surely be useless. Yeah, or even like a boise is even more than useless. It's like what are you doing? Like it's a negative kind of connotation, as if to say you can't buy this kind of love with money. Meaning you can't buy Torah with money. This is what the Gemara. This is what the verse is saying. So let's see how the Gemara tells us. My boys, what does the verse mean when it goes on to say, fourth line from the bottom of the page, fourth word, my boys, what does it mean when the verse says, spend all this money, you can't buy the love, you can't buy Torah? So Ullah explained like this. He gives three examples and tells us two are incorrect and one is correct. Like Shimon Achi Azariah, not like Shimon, the brother of Azariah, but like Rabbi Yochanan the Ben Nasiya, and not like Rabbi Yochanan and his relationship with the exilarch. Let's explain. Shimon and Azariah were brothers. Azariah, of course, the famous Azariah, studied Torah. It's all the way around. Shimon is the one who studied Torah, and his brother Azariah supported him in order that Azariah should get half of the merit of Shimon. And that was their arrangement from the beginning.
I mean, physically.
Yeah. Azariah, that's right. Shimon would study Torah, and Azariah would materially support him, materially, monetarily, fiscally. And likewise, Rabbi Yochanan was supported by, he was on the payroll of the exilarch. The exilarch, we explained a number of times, was like the Jewish political body, like the president of the Jewish community, that was much more organized. Were almost like many states within states. They had their own political system with their own system of governance and their own system of rules. Jewish community had follow the laws of the best, not the laws of the local land, and they just had to pay taxes to their local land. This was true for many, many years in many different communities. This was true in Poland, in France, in England, besides the times when we were kicked out. But while
it started in
Babylon, that's right, it started in Babylonia. So this is in Babylonia. It started in Bavel. That was called the exilarch. The exilarch, the Reish Galusa, was this political body embodied by one person, the head of the exilarch, who was like the president of the community and really ran the government, really ran the community. So Rabbi Yochanan was on the payroll of the exilarch because he was a great Torah scholar, and it was in the interest of the community to have someone like this who can study and teach. So he was on the payroll, and the idea was that the exilarch, the head of the exilarch, would share in the merit of Yochanan's Torah study. So we have Azariah supporting his brother Shimon, and the exilarch supporting Rabbi Yochanan. Says the Gemara, this is not the right example. This is an example of what the verse means when it says you can't buy your way into Torah study. But there is a way where you can. How's that? Ella kehillel v'shivna. Rather like Hillel and his brother Shivna. Who are these people? Hillel, Hillel, like the house of Hillel himself. Because when Avdimi arrived, he came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia. Omar, he told us, Hillel v'shivna achnihavim. Hillel and Shivna were brothers. Hillel asik b'Torah. Hillel studied Torah. He studied Torah, but remained impoverished. Shivna avad iska, and the brother Shivna went into business. L'soif, only later, Amar Lev did Shivna tell his brother Hillel, let's make a partnership and we'll split the merit. I'll support you so you can study Torah. That Yotza Baskal, a voice came out from heaven and said, this is when the verse, this is where heaven calls out the verse and says, maybe it's the other way around. I may have read this backwards. Let me tell you how I'm reading it now. Let's see if I got it wrong. So this is when the heavenly voice says, this is the right way to do it. Because Hillel was committed to studying Torah, even impoverished. Right? But I think I'm misreading it. Let me look at this.
Well, because
he remained impoverished.
He remained impoverished, and only later did his brother say, let's split the thing. So because he was
He
committed to
didn't
Torah study,
start Torah study on the premise.
that's right. He didn't start Torah study on the premise. That's right.
So
That's right.
therefore, it was valid.
He was
arrangement.
determined to be impoverished, like me.
No, after the arrangement.
Determined to be impoverished. It wouldn't let me.
Hold on a second. It could be the reverse. I'm not clear. It could be the reverse.
What do you mean, that Hillel was the?
It could be that
support and-
no, it could be the reverse, that Shivna got it wrong.
Oh.
Because only after his brother becomes a big scholar, then he says, "Oh, let me buy out half your
Oh,
merits."
He sort of discovered
Yeah.
that his brother was a great.
Exactly. So
scholar.
it could be the reverse, and that's the verse which says you can't buy your way into Torah study.
Ah,
Whereas the others, to begin with, he said, he supported him,
That's true too.
as opposed to. So I'm not sure which way is the right way to learn, but it could be both. I could see it both ways. And I'm trying to look over here in Rabbi Stein's commentary to see.
Show his stuff.
I think the second way is the right way, because the Gemara is calling, the verse says you cannot buy your way into Torah study, right?
Yeah.
And the heavenly voice is announcing this verse on Shivna and Hillel,
So
which
What
means
means
the verse which says you can't buy your way into Torah study belongs to Shivna and Hillel. And I think the reason is because Shivna is like, oh, only now for years Hillel's been studying Torah hard because he impoverished without a dime to his name studying Torah. And now you see value, now you're buying your way in. It doesn't work that way. Whereas Yochanan and Azariah, Yochanan and the exilarch, Azariah and Shimon, to begin with, they had this arrangement. Right? Not later trying to buy his way in. And that's when it's okay.
So
it seems like.
to begin with, you didn't know which way Hillel might.
That's right.
You-
So you took
didn't
the.
know how much
It's
merit
risk.
they had.
That's right. It's risk reward.
It's a risk.
It's
yeah.
risk reward. This
You're betting
Shivna
on it.
wants to come in risk free. The Torah study is already there. He wants to buy half, whereas the others were right from the beginning. Said they saw promise. They put down their thing. They put down payments with all the risk that comes along with it, perhaps. And which, by the way, it's interesting to note that Rambam had the same arrangement with his brother. Rambam had a brother named Yosef, who was a successful businessman, and for years Yosef supported his brother Moshe, his brother Rabbi, the Rambam, Moshe ben Maimon, and the whole family, his wife and children, his father, everybody. Until one day, Yosef went on a business trip and didn't come back. So he must have died in a shipwreck or something. And Rambam was very distraught over the loss of his brother. But it
This
came
while he was in
while they were in Egypt already.
Egypt.
When they were in Egypt already, yeah. At this point, the family started pressuring the Rambam. You got to start supporting it. But if you have a wife, you have children, you have people. I think I can't remember if their father was still alive at the time. I'm not sure if their father was still alive, but there's people to support. It's also his brother's wife, right, and their children. So they wanted him to take
Position with the Egyptian.
he was a rabbi. He was already a rabbi. They wanted him to take to earn a living for it.
But he was also
But
a physician.
He refused to get paid for being a rabbi. He said that the Mishnah says that a person should not make his Torah study into his profession. Torah study should be for the sake of Torah without monetary compensation. So he refused to take it's obviously not the case anymore. A person can't live like that.
Yeah.
But the Rambam refused to take money for his position as a rabbi. And that's when he started to work as a physician for pay. And that's when he got the position.
Well, he was also an extraordinary man.
Yeah.
Absolutely could do all these things. Not everybody could do.
Person in one lifetime
that.
to do what he did is not normal. Just the amount of books he put out and things that he did.
Prolific.
He's the kind of person who must have slept a few hours a night and spent every waking moment doing something. Tzedek also wrote prolifically. Yeah. But if you remember, Rambam writes a book of Jewish law that covers every single area of Jewish law. And you could see from he was an expert in every field. There are people who spend their entire life becoming an expert in one field. Let's say, just like the Kiddush HaChodesh, understanding how the sun and the moon works. It's clear that the man read Greek astronomy. And then you read his book on philosophy. He read Greek philosophy too. And then you read then he's a doctor. He read books on medicine, wrote his own books on medicine.
Actually incomprehensible.
Yeah.
Part on
Even something as small as when he goes to the laws of writing a Torah, right? So like in the Torah, there's like when you get an Aliyah, you see there's like breaks in the Torah, and the Torah text is like breaks. They're called chapters, right? So there's breaks there. So sometimes the break goes to the end of the line, and sometimes the break is only in the middle of the line. Now, how do you know when to put which breaks? So he did research. He got a hold of ancient Torah scrolls from different places, examined them all, and explains how he did that. And how he comes to the conclusion, here's the list of places where he make the breaks.
This is all on the run.
This is one little area of research he did for his 14-volume book, for one little small area of Torah law. I mean, it's a person on that level. It's incomprehensible. So he had an arrangement with his brother until his brother died, the same arrangement. Yosef supports him way from the beginning. They had this arrangement. Just like, okay, if we're going to go with the latter interpretation, which is that the correct way to do it is not like Hillel and Shivna, but the correct way to do it is like Ezra and his brother, Azariah and his brother Shimon, the exilarch and the Yochanan, were right from the outset, there's a support and a splitting of the, but if once the merit's there and you want to buy your way in, it doesn't work that way. Okay, a wonderful day, and a good Ner Shabbos.